Gotcha. Hey, how's it going everybody? It's the Game Economist, and today we'll be working on the Crow Talons. I went with kind of a typical dark build. I could have gone with the sharp buffed build, and the reason people like to use that is because if you use your weapon art on an opponent and you hit them with the entire weapon art, it's going to deal around 1,000, maybe a little more damage. It depends on their armor. And that can almost be a one-shot, right? People get really excited for that, but they're kind of underestimating just how hard it can be to actually land the weapon art against a skilled opponent. It can be pretty hard. And then at the same time, you don't have very good running attacks on this weapon, so when you're not using the weapon art, you don't really have any options for pressuring your opponent, and what this means is a smart opponent is just going to wait the buff out, or they're going to throw a dual charm on you, okay? So this isn't really an ideal weapon for using a buff build, and that's why I went with the dark build. You can notice I have a blessed Crow Talons in my left hand. That's because since this weapon is also a parry tool, it's kind of harder for your opponent to know when you're actually holding the parry tool out as opposed to dual wielding. So, you know, it's not going to fool everybody, but it's kind of a decent little trick you can take advantage of. And then finally, I have, as part of the build, I have the kukri throwing knife. I felt like that was a nice little addition. Felt like it gave me maybe a bit of a ranged option that I could spam a little bit. You can, of course, use the lightning urn as well. So either of those will work, but the kukri it felt kind of like an extended R2. Alright, let's start talking about how to use this weapon in duels. I really want to give you guys the information you need to be as effective as possible. So, the first thing I want to say is that the weapon art is actually really important. You've got to practice the weapon art because when you catch somebody in it, I was dealing about 600 damage. If I landed the whole combo from the weapon art, it was about 600 damage. That's pretty significant. At the same time, that leap has pretty good range. It can roll catch. And is really surprising, actually you might not know this, it actually has a ton of hyper armor. You know, I was interrupted out of it one time. I was interrupted by an R2, like a charged R2 on a great hammer, and that's about all that's interrupted me, so it has a lot of hyper armor. What's nice about it is you can use this weapon art against most of the ultra great weapons, and because of the timing on their swings, they typically tend to miss you when you charge it up. They don't expect it. They start to swing, but the swing is too late because there's a delay on the weapon art, on the Crow Talon weapon art, and then they end up missing you and you just leap right into them and deal 600 damage. And if they do hit you, you end up winning the trade. So it's really kind of an interesting weapon art, but it's really, really important that you get good at using it because this is how you're going to deal most of your damage, and it's kind of the central idea of this weapon. You really do need to be good at the weapon art. The next move I want to talk about is the rolling R1. So the rolling R1 is you do like an extra little roll on the ground and then you throw your fist out in front of you, right? Some of the other weapons have this as well. What I discovered about it is you can be rolling to the left or to the right, or you can be rolling backwards, and when you activate it, it always goes towards your opponent. So I've learned to use it kind of like a different kind of running attack, if you want to think of it that way. It's really quite good. You can roll, you know, to the left or the right of your opponent, and when you activate it, it'll actually chase after your opponent and stab them. A lot of players don't expect that. Now, I didn't actually expect it either. I actually had to learn to do that. Now, the running L1 is terrible. That's the one where you do a jump in the air as a crow. I basically just use it like an emote. I just use it for fun. The problem with it is it has a really long wind-up time. It has very few active frames where your opponent can take damage, and it doesn't have very good range either. So, really bad. The L1 is usually a 1-2 punch when you're talking about the running attacks on a fist claw weapon. Not for Crow Talons, and that's going to hold it back in the tier ratings. The R2 actually has some decent range, so use that R2 for roll catching. I like to do an R1 combo, and then I would go for the R2 roll catch. At the end of your weapon art, if you have enough stamina left, you can actually go for the R2 roll catch there too, and if you do that, you're going to be dealing like 800, 900 damage, so that's pretty significant. Weapon art, R2 roll catch, okay? So the R2 has good range. And remember, you've got the kukri with you too, so you can kind of try to outspace your opponent. And you've got a parry tool with you as well. You can go for a parry. You know, since we've gone with the dark build, you've got the chaos dagger on you. That's a one-shot, just guaranteed. If you ever parry somebody, you've won the match. The match is over. So those are all things to think about. But I want to move on to talking about the weakness of the Crow Talons, because this is really important. The problem with the Crow Talons, they have a combination of problems, and when you have all of them together, it makes for a really weak weapon. So the R1 and the L1, those are you've got neutral attacks on both of those, right? On most weapons, you use it defensively. You go, unless you're playing like a spear or something. But the neutral R1 on a Crow Talon is really short range. On top of that, you don't have any poise. And then finally, you don't do that much damage. Now, the L1 actually does do damage if you're lucky enough to catch somebody. But I say lucky enough because just like the R1, the startup time of the L1 is way too long, right? Your opponent gets plenty of time to react, or they get time to interrupt you, which is so annoying. They really, I think From really ought to come into the game and just speed up the timing of the L1 and the R1, and then claws would be a lot more viable if they would just do that. But as it is, if your opponent is using like a curved sword or some sort of thrusting sword like the S-stock, they're not only able to basically outrange you the whole game, but they're able to outspeed you with their own R1, right? So if you try to attack like a thrusting sword, their R1 will come out first and interrupt you. And so yeah, the combination of those three problems, you've got short range, you don't have poise, and you don't have enough damage. The combination of those three problems really hold the Crow Talons back, and that's probably why you almost never see them, because you're always at a disadvantage when you're using these weapons because of those problems. And I really would like to see From come in and fix it. I don't know what they could do, but I think if they sped up the R1 to be about dagger speed, then they would be a lot more viable. And they wouldn't even be overpowered. They would just be more viable, right? Having range in this game is really important. So just the short range is always going to hold this weapon back. But if they were as fast as a dagger, the R1, I think it would be a lot better. And you could even keep the L1 to be a little slower. If you catch somebody in the L1, it deals about 500, 600 damage. So it's not, it's okay if you want to keep that one slow, but the R1 really does need to be sped up because it needs to be competing with things like thrusting swords, curved swords. There's no reason why the claws, with their mediocre damage and their terrible range, there's no reason why they should be slower than those weapons. In Invasions, this weapon was even worse. So basically, in Invasions, one of the ways that I like to measure the quality of a weapon is how good it is at punishing heals. And the Crow Talons could not punish heals at all. It's very hard to stay on your opponent. And if you do catch up to them, by the time your R1 comes out, they're already done drinking and they've rolled away. So if you think this is hard in duels, you don't know how hard it is in Invasions. It's much worse. You're not able to deal with groups at all. You have no poise, you have no range, and the damage, you're not going to be one-shotting anybody. That being said, if you get really good at parrying with this, the parry's always a one-shot, so you just run in and parry everybody. That's your best strategy for Invasions. So even though the weapon itself, the moveset on this weapon was really struggling in Invasions, I was still winning my Invasions at about the same rate, because I would just parry the host. That's what it came down to. I would just parry or backstab the host, okay? So it wasn't that bad as long as you're focusing on parries and backstabs. But if you actually want to play it as if you like the Crow Talons, you're not going to get very far. You're going to be struggling the whole time. Your opponent is going to have more Estus than you, so you're going to run out of Estus, and you're going to have to Black Crystal out of there. Okay, so Invasions, it gets a bad rating. Finally, in PvE, PvE is always an interesting way to measure the weapon because the AI in this game are pretty stupid. They don't have, they don't take advantage of your weaknesses very well, and you can memorize how they fight, so you can pretty consistently land your shots. So the problem with the Crow Talons is unless you're doing a buffed build, the damage on it is still kind of mediocre. You might as well be using a thrusting sword and have better range and better speed on your attacks. That being said, if you did go with the buffed build, you'd be able to do quite a lot of damage with the weapon art. So it'd be pretty fun, I imagine, like jumping into, I don't know, like one of the bigger enemies with your weapon art and dealing maybe 1,000, 1,200 damage to them. It's actually, I imagine, a lot of fun. I didn't test that out myself because I didn't go with the buffed build, but if you're just going with the dark build, it's going to be a pretty mediocre, kind of an underwhelming weapon. You're always going to have to be in very close range of your opponent, which means this is more of a weapon for advanced PvE players and not for beginners. Once again, it's not for beginners. So again, it's going to get kind of lower than mid-tier ratings for the PvE. For Invasions, it's going to be low tier. For duels, it's going to be low tier, unfortunately. And if From would just come back in, do one more balance change to kind of increase the quality of life of this game, there's still a lot of people playing it. If they would just come in and do that, that would be really appreciated. Alright guys, well there's going to be invasions at the end as usual, and then tier ratings at the end of the invasions. I hope you enjoy them, and I'll see you next time.
Hello!
Game over!
Hi, Georgie. Aren't you going to say hello? Oh, come on, bucko. Don't you want a balloon?
I'm not supposed to take stuff from strangers. My dad said so.
And when you're down here with me, you float down!
Thank you!
Can't even die right.
You really want to know?
What?
Are you sure you want to know?
What did they do?
You getcha!
Overall, I will have to give Kraft Miracle Whip Original Dressing on the food scale rating a 7 out of 10. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode.